Is everything ready for class?
Almost. I just need the lesson notes.
They're already on your desk. Attention viewer, you loved our short films, so now we want to make a full 1-hour movie. Once we reach 100 Patreon members, production can officially begin. Thank you to everyone already supporting us. Scan the code or click the link below to join, and help us make this movie possible.
Daniel Mercer had taught in a lot of strange places. A prefab schoolhouse on a mining moon where the walls hummed with drill vibrations. A refugee transit station where his students changed every 6 weeks. A colony ship where gravity failed twice during his lessons and the children thought it was the best part of the day. He had never taught inside a palace. The transport that carried him down through Vulpine atmosphere was a modest diplomatic shuttle. Nothing like the gilded vessels he'd glimpsed docked at the upper platforms. But even so, Daniel pressed his hand flat against the window like a child seeing snow for the first time. Below him, the capital city of Ashenvale unfolded in copper and green. Spires wrapped in living vine, canals that glowed faintly blue at dusk, and at the center of it all, the palace itself, a structure that seemed to have grown rather than been built, its towers curling upward like something reaching for the twin moons. "You are staring," said the Vulpine steward beside him, not unkindly. His name was Oren, and he had the clipped, patient voice of someone used to shepherding nervous foreigners. "Everyone stares. It is permitted for now. It will not be permitted once you are inside." "Sorry," Daniel said. "I've just never seen anything like it." Oren's ears twitched. Amusement, Daniel had learned, though he was still getting used to reading the language written across every Vulpine's ears and tail before it ever reached their mouth. "You will teach the youngest court children. Etiquette says little of you beyond competence and discretion. Do you have those?" "I have a teaching license and 11 years of experience with kids who set things on fire for fun. I think I can manage discretion." Oren's tail gave one slow, considering sweep. "We will see." Daniel's position had come through an exchange program half buried in the fine print of the human Vulpine Accord. An attempt, 3 generations after first contact, to normalize relations by embedding human educators and specialists inside Vulpine institutions, and Vulpine specialists inside human ones. He'd applied on a whim, mostly because his sister had dared him to, and he'd been shocked when the acceptance letter came addressed not from a university but from the Ashenvale royal household. 6 months, educating children of the court, ages 7 through 12, in human history, mathematics, and comparative civics, the letter had said. Housing and full court privileges provided. Discretion expected in all matters. He hadn't fully understood what full court privileges meant until he was standing in the receiving hall on his first morning, being fitted for formal robes he did not know how to wear, surrounded by nobles who looked at him the way people look at an interesting but faintly embarrassing zoo animal. "You're the human," said a young noblewoman with silver-tipped ears and eyes like cut topaz, drifting close enough that her tail nearly brushed his arm. "Lady Thessaly?" "I teach the youngest ones dance, when I am not being decorative at my mother's insistence. You'll want an ally in this place. I offer myself." "That's very generous," Daniel said, feeling his collar was suddenly too tight. "It is not generous. It is strategic." Thessaly smiled, all teeth, not unfriendly. "A human tutor who wins royal favor is worth knowing. A human tutor who fails is worth avoiding early. I am simply hedging until I know which you'll be." Daniel decided then and there that he was going to like the palace about as much as he liked being evaluated for his market value, which was to say, not very much at all. It was on his second day, lost in a servant's corridor he wasn't supposed to be in, hunting for the East classroom wing, that he met her. She was kneeling on the stone floor, gathering a dropped basket of laundered linens that had come untied, moving with the quick, unfussy efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times and resented none of it. Bright amber fur, threaded faintly gold where the corridor's low light caught it. A simple gray servant's dress, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her ears were pinned back, focus, not fear. And her tail, long and unusually plumed for a maid's tail, curled protectively around the spilled linens as if to keep them from sliding further. "Let me help," Daniel said, crouching down before he'd even decided to. She looked up, startled, and Daniel forgot, for one full second, how to form words. Her eyes were emerald, not the muddy green of most vulpine eyes he'd seen so far, but a deep, clear, startling color, like something lit from within. It should not have been possible for a maid gathering dropped laundry to look like that, and Daniel had the fleeting, absurd thought that whoever had assigned her to corridor duty was wasting a face that belonged on a coin. "You don't need to," she said. Her voice was low, a little wry. "Lords don't usually get down on the floor. I'm not a lord. I'm the human tutor. Daniel." He held out a stack of linens. "And even if I were a lord, I don't think that's a rule I'd want to keep." Something flickered across her face, surprise, and under it, something warmer. "Varessa," she said. "I work the East Wing. Then you can show me where the East classroom is. I've been walking in circles for 20 minutes and I'm fairly sure a guard has started timing me." Varessa laughed, a real laugh, quick and unguarded, and Daniel decided immediately that he wanted to hear it again. "That would be Captain Oren. He times everyone. It's how he shows affection." She rose, basket balanced on her hip, and tipped her head down the corridor. "Come on, then, human tutor. Let's not keep the captain's stopwatch waiting." She walked fast, the way people walk when they're used to having somewhere to be, and Daniel found himself half jogging to keep pace, grinning like an idiot the entire way. He would spend the rest of the week finding reasons to get lost in that corridor again. His classroom, such as it was, occupied a sunlit chamber on the second floor of the East Wing, high windows, a scattering of low desk size for children, and walls painted with a fading mural of some ancient vulpine hunt that Daniel privately thought was far too violent for an educational setting, though no one had asked his opinion on the palace's decorating choices. His first week was, by any honest measure, a disaster. The children didn't know what to make of him. He was too tall, his ears didn't move, and worse, he insisted on things like raising your hand and waiting your turn to speak. Concepts that seemed, to 6 vulpine children raised in a palace where rank determined who spoke first, faintly absurd. "Why should I wait?" demanded a girl named Ophelia, whose father was a minor treasury minister. "If I have something more important to say than Fennec?" "Because everyone's thoughts get a turn, regardless of whose father has a bigger office," Daniel said, and watched 6 sets of ears swivel toward him in identical, startled attention, as if he'd said something faintly scandalous. It was Varessa, oddly, who helped him find his footing. Not through any direct instruction, since a maid delivering linens to a tutor's classroom would have been remarked upon, but through the small, sideways comments she left with him in their corridor crossings each morning. "They test you because testing is the only power they have," she told him once, balancing a folded stack of curtains on one hip. "A minister's daughter has no real authority over anything in this palace. She's 7. But if she can make the human tutor flinch, that's a victory nobody can take from her. Don't flinch, and she'll stop needing to try." That's uncomfortably insightful for someone who does laundry for a living. "I told you. Invisibility teaches you things." Her ears flicked, amused. "Also, I was a difficult child myself, once. I recognize the type." Daniel took her advice, and it worked better than anything in his teaching certification ever had. By the second week, Ophelia had stopped testing him and started, instead, competing for his approval with the same intensity she'd once spent trying to provoke him, a shift Daniel found simultaneously encouraging and mildly terrifying, since a 7-year-old's approval-seeking could apparently manifest as bringing him increasingly elaborate gifts of pressed flowers. For the classroom, each one accompanied by a pointed look to see if he'd noticed who had brought the nicest one. Fennec, meanwhile, had appointed himself Daniel's unofficial cultural liaison, correcting his pronunciation, explaining which nobles he should avoid making eye contact with at formal functions, and occasionally offering unsolicited commentary on Daniel's wardrobe. "You're wearing that again," Fennec observed one morning, surveying Daniel's second-best jacket with the withering judgment only a 9-year-old aristocrat could muster. "Miss Varessa says humans don't care much about appearances." I told her I didn't think that was true, because you clearly try, you're just bad at it. Thank you, Fennec. Truly. I feel very supported. You're welcome. Fennec said, entirely missing the sarcasm, which somehow made it funnier. It was a small life those first weeks, lesson plans and corridor conversations and the slow, unhurried business of learning a strange new place. But Daniel found himself, more mornings than not, waking with something like anticipation instead of the low-grade loneliness that had followed him from colony to colony for most of his adult life. He told himself it was the job. He was beginning to suspect, even then, that it was something considerably more specific than that. It became, over the following weeks, a habit neither of them named aloud. On the evenings Varessa's duties ended early enough, she would find Daniel on the small rooftop terrace above the east wing, a forgotten corner of the palace accessible only through a narrow stairwell most of the household had stopped bothering with generations ago, its stone balustrade worn smooth by disuse. "How did you even find this place?" Daniel asked, the first evening she appeared there, startling him mid-lesson plan with an armful of 2 teacups she'd apparently smuggled from the kitchens. "I make it my business to know every forgotten corner of a building I intend to hide in," Varessa said, settling beside him with the particular unhurried ease she never quite managed anywhere more visible. "Every palace has them. Places built for a purpose nobody remembers anymore, left standing because tearing them down felt like more trouble than ignoring them. I find that rather comforting, honestly. That structures can outlive their reason and still be useful for something else entirely." "Is that a metaphor?" "Everything's a metaphor if you squint hard enough. I simply liked the tea and thought you might enjoy the view." She nodded toward the horizon, where Ashenvale's spires caught the last amber light of evening, the canals below just beginning their nightly shift to soft blue luminescence. "Also, it's quiet. I don't get much quiet most days." "Laundry that demanding?" Something flickered behind her eyes, a shadow Daniel would only understand the shape of much later, before she smiled and deflected, the way she always did when a conversation edged too close to the truth she wasn't ready to share. "You'd be amazed how demanding linens can be. Endless opinions on how they prefer to be folded." They fell into an easy rhythm on that terrace over the following weeks, Daniel grading papers while Varessa mended small things she'd brought up from the servants' hall, both of them talking in the unhurried way people talk when there's no urgency pressing them toward any particular conclusion. She asked him about Earth, about the colonies he taught on, about whether he missed any of the places he'd left behind. He asked her about Ashenvale's history, its festivals, the strange local superstitions the children brought into his classroom, half-formed and eager to test against a foreigner's reaction. "Do you ever want to leave?" he asked once, watching her needle move with quick, practiced precision through a torn hem. "The palace, I mean. See somewhere else." Varessa's hands stilled, just briefly, before resuming their work. "Sometimes I think I'd like to see everywhere else," she said carefully. "But leaving a place you belong to, even a difficult place, is more complicated than it sounds. There are obligations that don't release you just because you've grown tired of carrying them." "That sounds like it's coming from experience." "Everything I say comes from experience, tutor. I'm simply better than most people at not specifying which experience." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes this time, and Daniel, sensing, without understanding why, that he'd wandered close to something tender, let the subject drop, filing it away instead among the growing collection of small, unresolved mysteries that made up the woman beside him. It was on the terrace, 3 weeks before the summons arrived, that she first fell asleep against his shoulder. Exhausted from a long day, the teacups long since gone cold between them, her breathing slow and even in the cooling evening air. Daniel sat perfectly still for nearly an hour rather than wake her, watching the twin moons rise over Ashenvale's spires, and understood, somewhere in that hour of comfortable stillness, that whatever this was between them had stopped being a passing curiosity and become something he would very much regret losing. He did not yet know how close he would come to losing it, or how much larger the losing would turn out to be than he could possibly have imagined from a rooftop terrace with cold tea and a sleeping maid whose whole life was, in fact, considerably larger than the small, quiet corner she'd shown him. It became a pattern within 2 weeks, though either of them named it as one. Varessa's duties took her through the same wing where Daniel's classroom sat, and his mornings developed a strange new rhythm: arrive early, hope to catch her delivering linens or trimming the hall's flowering vines, and if he did, walk with her as far as their paths overlapped, trading a few sentences that always felt like far more than a few sentences worth. She was, he began to realize, unlike anyone else in the palace. The nobles wanted to know what he thought of Vulpine architecture, Vulpine cuisine, Vulpine superiority in 17 unprompted categories. Varessa wanted to know what he'd been like as a child, whether human classrooms really let students choose their own questions, whether it was true that humans cried at weddings and funerals, which she found either beautiful or deeply confusing. She hadn't decided. Both, Daniel told her, one afternoon in the palace's outer garden, where she'd found him grading essays on a bench beneath a canopy tree with silver-veined leaves. Weddings are just funerals for being single. You're mourning the old life a little, even while you're happy about the new one. Varessa considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything, ears tilted forward. That is either the most romantic thing a human has ever said to me, or the least. I contain multitudes. You contain something, she said, and sat down beside him without asking, which nobody at court ever did. They waited for permission, for rank to be established, for the small performances of hierarchy Daniel was slowly learning to navigate. Varessa simply sat, tail curling neatly around her ankles, and picked up one of his ungraded essays like she had every right to read it. You can't do that, Daniel said, not moving to stop her. I already am. She scanned the page, ears flicking with interest. This child thinks your Roman Republic invented the concept of citizenship. That is incorrect. Ashenvale had a citizens' council 400 years before your Rome existed. Daniel blinked. How do you know that? A pause, small, almost nothing, but Daniel would remember it later, turning it over. Everyone knows their own history, Varessa said lightly, handing the essay back. You'll want to correct him gently. He's the tanner's son and he cries easily. You know whose son he is. I know a great many things, human tutor. It comes from being invisible. People say the truest things in front of servants, because they've stopped seeing us as people who listen. She said it without bitterness, almost matter of fact, but something in Daniel's chest tightened anyway. I see you, he said before he could think better of it. Varessa went very still. Her tail, which had been swishing lazily, stopped mid-motion. For a moment neither of them said anything, and Daniel had the dizzying sense of having said something far larger than he'd intended. That, she said finally, quietly, is a dangerous thing to tell a maid. Why? She didn't answer. She stood, smoothed her skirts, and was gone before he could find the words to call her back. But her ears, he noticed, stayed pink-flushed at the base the whole way across the garden, a physiological tell he hadn't yet learned to name, but one that made his pulse do something complicated regardless. He asked Oren about her, carefully, over evening tea he'd been invited to share as a courtesy extended to visiting staff. Varessa, Oren repeated, and something crossed his weathered face too fast for Daniel to read. There are several maids by that name in the household registry. Amber fur, unusually elegant tail, works the east wing near the royal children's quarters. Green eyes you don't forget. Oren's cup paused halfway to his mouth. You've spent time with her. She's easy to talk to. Daniel shrugged, feeling suddenly exposed. Is that a problem? It is not my place to say who a tutor speaks with. Oren set his cup down with unusual precision. But I would advise caution, Mercer. The palace has currents beneath its floors that are not always visible from the surface. Some servants are simply servants. Some are not simply anything. That's ominous. It is meant to be. Oren's tail flicked once, sharply. Enjoy your tea. Daniel went to bed that night with the strange, itching sense of having stumbled onto the edge of something much larger than a friendship with a pretty maid. But he was tired, and hopeful, and 29 years old and lonely in a way he hadn't examined closely in a long time, and so he let the feeling drift, unresolved, into sleep. The children were, in their own way, Daniel's first real allies in the palace, and it was through them that he came to know Varessa's presence in the household in fuller detail than he'd have found on his own. There were 6 of them in his morning class, sons and daughters of minor court officials, too young yet to be angling for marriage alliances, still small enough to find the world genuinely interesting rather than merely useful. The eldest, a serious boy named Fennec with ears too large for his head and a habit of correcting Daniel's pronunciation of Vulpine words with startling confidence, had taken an immediate liking to him. The youngest, a girl called Sable who bit her stylus when she was thinking, had taken an immediate liking to anyone who let her sit closest to the window. Miss Varessa says humans invented boats before they invented wheels, Fennec announced one morning apropos of nothing, while Daniel was attempting to explain the concept of representative government. Is that true? Daniel blinked. It actually might be. Depends on the region. Where did you hear that? She tells us things sometimes, when she brings the linens. She knows a lot for a maid. Fennec said this with the guileless bluntness only children managed, unaware he just handed Daniel another thread to add to his growing, unexamined pile. She's my favorite person who isn't a teacher. She let me keep a broken teacup once instead of telling the steward, because I was sad about breaking it, and she said sad feelings don't need extra punishment on top. That sounds like her, Daniel said, and felt something warm and unguarded bloom in his chest that had nothing to do with lesson planning. Sable, not to be outdone, produced a slightly crushed paper flower from her pocket. She taught me to fold these. She said her. The girl paused, frowning, working to remember the exact words. Her nursemaid taught her, a long time ago, before the nursemaid went away. Daniel filed this away too, another small inconsistency in a portrait that was slowly, without his quite noticing, becoming impossible to explain by ordinary means. A maid who spoke of a nursemaid, as though servanthood itself had once been beneath her rather than her whole life's occupation. A maid who knew treaties, currents of history, the precise mechanics of grain tariffs. A maid the guards bowed to when they thought no one was counting. He told himself, each time, that palaces were strange places, full of strange people with unusual pasts, and that it was none of his business to go digging in Varessa's history any more than he'd want her digging in his. It was, in hindsight, a convenient thing to believe, and Daniel knew even then that convenience was doing a great deal of the work. The first time Daniel noticed it, he told himself he'd imagined it. He was walking with Varessa through the lesser hall. A long gallery lined with portraits of Vulpine monarchs going back a dozen generations, their painted eyes all sharp and gold and faintly disapproving, on their way to fetch chalk from the supply room, when 2 palace guards posted at the far archway straightened as she passed. Not the loose, general attention guards paid to any passing member of the household. A precise, brief inclination of the head. A bow, cut short, as if caught and corrected mid-motion. Varessa didn't appear to notice. Or she noticed and had long practiced not noticing. Did those guards just... Daniel started. They're new, Varessa said quickly. Still learning the household protocols. Half the time they don't know who outranks whom. She picked up her pace, and the moment passed, and Daniel let it go, because the alternative explanation forming at the edge of his mind seemed too strange to hold on to in daylight. It happened again 2 days later, more subtly. An older servant, arms full of firewood, stepping fully aside into the wall alcove to let Varessa pass first, a courtesy Daniel had only ever seen extended to nobility. And again, when a groundskeeper trimming the garden hedges dropped instantly to one knee at the sight of her from across the lawn, before catching himself, rising, and pretending with visible effort that nothing had happened. Daniel began keeping a mental list. He told himself it was curiosity, the same instinct that made him good at his job, noticing what didn't add up, following the thread until the picture resolved. He told himself it wasn't suspicion, though some quieter, more honest part of him understood it was becoming exactly that. He never asked her directly. Something in him, some protective, superstitious instinct, didn't want to break whatever spell let her sit beside him in the garden without performing rank, let her argue with him about human wedding customs, let her be simply Varessa instead of whatever else the guard's bent knees suggested she might be. Instead, he watched, and wondered, and fell for her anyway, thread by unresolved thread. She knew things she shouldn't have known. Not just history. Though that continued, casual asides about treaties and successions delivered with the ease of someone reciting family stories rather than reading textbooks. But the deeper mechanics of court itself. Which noble houses feuded and why? Which ambassador's proposal the crown was likely to reject before the vote was even called? Once, overhearing two ministers arguing in a corridor about grain tariffs, she murmured to Daniel, unprompted, exactly how the dispute would resolve. And was proven right within the week. "You should work in the treasury," Daniel told her, half joking, one evening as they sat on the low garden wall watching the twin moons rise pale over the eastern towers. "I prefer laundry," Varessa said. "Less lying involved." "Every job involves lying eventually." "Not to the sheets." Her tail swished, content, brushing his ankle where they sat close together. Closer than propriety technically allowed, though either of them had acknowledged the shrinking distance between their bodies over the past weeks. The way conversations had gotten longer, quieter, more inclined to silence that didn't need filling. "Sheets don't ask you to smile at people you despise. Is there a lot of that? People you despise? More than you'd think, in a palace?" She glanced at him sideways, ears tilting in that considering way he'd come to recognize. "You are the rare exception, human tutor. I don't have to perform anything for you. That is unusual. And I find I like it more than I probably should." Daniel's heart did something reckless in his chest. "I like you exactly as unperformed as you are." Varessa looked at him for a long moment, emerald eyes catching the moonlight, and Daniel watched her nose twitch, the smallest tell, one he'd learned meant she was fighting some emotion too large to easily hold. Before she looked away, out at the gardens, and said nothing at all. But she didn't move away either. She let her shoulder rest against his, warm and solid and real, and they sat like that until the night guard's bell rang the hour, and she had to go. The Vulpine calendar turned, as it did every autumn, toward the Festival of Lanterns. A week-long celebration commemorating the founding of Ashenvale, when every canal in the capital filled with floating paper lights and the whole city, noble and common alike, spilled into the streets to eat honeyed nuts and watch the twin moons rise through a haze of drifting flame. The court held its own smaller observance within the palace walls, a private garden ceremony for the household, and Daniel found himself invited. Awkwardly, as an afterthought, tutors being neither quite noble nor quite servant, and therefore perpetually uncertain of their place at any given function. He nearly didn't go. It was Varessa, catching him in the corridor with an armful of lanterns she'd been tasked with distributing, who talked him into it. "You have to come," she said, pressing a small unlit lantern into his hands, shaped like a curled foxtail, delicate paper stretched over a thin wire frame. "It's the one night servants and nobles stand in the same garden and nobody minds. Even Lady Thessaly softens up a little. It's very undignified. You'd hate to miss it. I don't know how to light these things without setting my own robes on fire. I'll teach you." Her ears flicked, pleased. "It's not hard. You just have to trust the wick more than you trust your own nerves." That evening, the garden filled with warm light and low music from string instruments Daniel didn't recognize, and Varessa, off duty for the first time he'd seen, dressed still simply but with a ribbon threaded through her fur that caught the lantern glow like a vein of gold, taught him to cup the small flame steady against the evening breeze, guiding his hands with her own until the little foxtail lantern caught and lifted, gently, into the darkening sky. "Make a wish," she said. "It's tradition. Nobody remembers why anymore, but we do it regardless." What do you wish for? Varessa watched their lantern rise, joining the 100 others already drifting above the garden walls like a slow constellation. I wish, she said carefully, that whatever happens next, I get to keep the parts of my life that feel like this. Simple. Chosen. Mine. Daniel didn't understand then the full weight beneath the wish. He only knew that standing beside her in lantern light, her shoulder brushing his, felt like something he wanted to keep as well, and so he made the same wish without knowing he was echoing her exactly. They stayed in the garden long after most of the household had drifted back inside, watching lanterns climb until they became indistinguishable from stars, and when Varessa finally laced her fingers through his, wordless, Daniel understood that whatever else was true about her, whatever secrets sat unspoken beneath her easy laughter, this, at least, was real. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. He was right. He simply didn't yet understand how much that certainty would be tested. You're spending time with the amber-furred maid, Thessaly said, cornering Daniel in the receiving hall with the particular directness of a noble woman who considered subtlety a tool for people less confident of their own standing. The one from the East Wing. Word travels. Word is currency here, human tutor, and you're spending yours badly. Thessaly's tail flicked, sharp and assessing. Do you know who she is? Daniel's stomach tightened. A maid named Varessa. That's what she calls herself, yes. Thessaly studied him with something that might have been pity. I'll say this once, because I find you tolerable and because watching a fool walk into a wall is only entertaining the first time. That maid is not what she appears. Whatever you're building with her, end it, or prepare for it to end you. There are rooms in this palace built for people who reach above their station, human. I would rather not watch you be put in one. Is that a threat? It's a kindness. Thessaly turned to go, then paused, ears twitching with something almost like reluctant sympathy. For what it's worth, I don't think she's playing you. I think that's what worries me. She left before Daniel could ask what she meant, and he spent the rest of the day turning her words over like stones, looking for the shape of the thing hidden underneath. That night he found Varessa in the small kitchen off the servants' hall, alone, mending a torn hem by lamplight with a needle held in fingers far too steady for someone doing menial work at the end of a long day. He watched her from the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. The careful, unhurried competence of her, the way her ears stayed relaxed even in solitude, a person entirely comfortable in her own skin. Thessaly warned me off you today, Daniel said. Varessa's needle paused. Did she? Told me you weren't what you appear to be. Told me there were rooms in this palace for people who reach above their station. He crossed the kitchen and sat across from her, close enough to see the flush rising at the base of her ears. Varessa. Who are you? For a long moment she said nothing, and Daniel watched something war behind her eyes, the flicker of a decision being made and unmade and made again. I'm someone who has enjoyed, for the first time in longer than I can say, being looked at without an agenda attached, she said finally, quiet and careful. I'm someone who would like to keep that a little longer, if you'll let me. That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you tonight. Her hand found his across the table, warm, her thumb tracing an absent line across his knuckles. Please, Daniel. A little longer. He should have pushed. Every rational instinct told him to push, to demand the truth before he let himself fall any further into something that might be built on ground he couldn't see. But her hand was warm in his, and her eyes were pleading in a way that had nothing performed in it, and Daniel Mercer had spent his whole life choosing kindness over caution when the two came into conflict. A little longer, he agreed, and told himself it wasn't a mistake. The autumn accord dinner was, Daniel had been warned repeatedly, the single most important social function on the palace calendar outside the choosing itself. An annual gathering of noble houses, off-world dignitaries, and ranking household staff, ostensibly to celebrate the founding treaty between the Vulpine Empire and its allied systems, but functionally, everyone agreed, an elaborate performance of status dressed up as hospitality. Daniel had not wanted to attend. Tutors, technically, were required to, and so he found himself seated at a table near the hall's edge, several tiers below the head table where the Regency Council and visiting dignitaries dined, wedged between a young off-world attaché who spoke exclusively about shipping tariffs and an elderly Vulpine astronomer who fell asleep between courses. He spent most of the meal watching, instead, the servants moving along the hall's perimeter. And it took him embarrassingly long to spot Varessa among them, dressed in the same gray uniform as the others, carrying a tray of the second course with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything. She did not look at him. He understood dimly that this was deliberate, that a maid catching a tutor's eye across a formal hall would draw exactly the kind of attention neither of them wanted. But it still produced a small, unreasonable ache in his chest to watch her move past his table without so much as a flicker of acknowledgement, invisible in the precise way she'd once told him servants learned to be. It was Thessaly, seated 2 places down, who caught him watching. "You're staring at the wrong table, human tutor," she said, low enough for only him to hear, her tail flicking with something between amusement and warning. "The dignitaries are up there. The gossip is up there. The advantageous marriages are up there. Down here," she nodded toward the servants' circuit along the wall, "is simply staff. I wasn't staring at anyone. You were staring at the Amberford maid so intently I worried you might set her uniform on fire through sheer force of attention." Thessaly's eyes narrowed, assessing. "I did warn you." "You did. And yet." "And yet," Daniel agreed, and found he didn't particularly regret it, whatever consequence Thessaly's warning had been gesturing toward. Later that evening, after the dignitaries had retired and the hall had emptied of everyone but the staff clearing dishes, Daniel found an excuse to linger, checking a supposed lesson-planning note in the adjoining study. Until Varessa passed through with the last of the serving trays, exhausted, hair coming loose from its pins, and utterly unguarded now that the performance of invisibility was no longer required. "Long night?" he asked. "You have no idea." She set the tray down and rubbed at her wrist, wincing slightly. "Carrying trays for 4 hours is harder than it looks, tutor. You should try it sometime, before you get too comfortable pitying servants from your comfortable little table." "I wasn't pitying anyone. I was admiring how well you carried it. Also wondering why you wouldn't look at me all evening." Something in her expression softened, guarded and grateful at once. "Because if I look at you the way I want to look at you in a room full of people who catalog everything, we'll both have a much more complicated evening than either of us wants. How do you want to look at me?" Varessa considered this, tired and unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself to be, and said quietly, "Like you're the only interesting thing in the whole hall. Which, for the record, you generally are." Daniel felt something in his chest go warm and reckless. "You could look at me like that right now. The hall's empty." She did. It lasted only a few seconds, a full, unguarded look, emerald eyes steady on his, ears soft and forward, tail curling once, contentedly, against the floor. Before the door creaked at the far end of the hall, and she snapped back into brisk servant efficiency, gathering the tray and disappearing toward the kitchens before whoever it was could round the corner. Daniel stood alone in the emptied hall for a long moment afterward, grinning like a fool, and did not notice, until much later, that the person who'd interrupted them had been Chancellor Yold herself, standing in the doorway with an expression of quiet, calculating thoughtfulness that had nothing to do with dinner at all. What Daniel didn't know, what Varessa had carried alone for 11 months, through every laundry basket and every stolen garden conversation, was this. She was Varessa Ashimkel, Crown Princess of the Vulpine Empire, heir to a throne that had sat empty since her mother's death, and she had fled her own coronation. Not out of cowardice. Out of exhaustion so total it had felt, on the night she'd cut her hair shorter and dyed the ceremonial gold thread markings from her fur and walked out of the royal apartments in a stolen servant's dress, like the only sane choice left available to her. She had grown up watched. Every smile catalogued for political weight, every friendship investigated for hidden motive, every suitor who'd ever approached her doing so with calculation dressed as courtship, reciting poetry about her beauty while their eyes tracked the treasury reports behind her. She had been, since birth, less a person than an asset. The most celebrated beauty in the Vulpine Empire, a phrase used so often in her presence it had stopped feeling like a compliment, and started feeling like a cage built entirely out of other people's expectations. 3 suitors in the final year before her scheduled coronation had proposed. All 3, she'd later learn through careful, quiet investigation, had commissioned private assessments of the crown's treasury before commissioning any assessment of her character. The 4th had recited, unprompted, a full accounting of her lineage's holdings during what he'd apparently believed was a romantic dinner. So she had run, not far, not forever, just far enough to become invisible in the one place no one would think to search, inside her own palace, dressed as one of the 1,000 servants who kept it running, hidden in plain sight by the simple, brutal truth that nobility rarely looked closely at the people who cleaned up after them. She had told herself it was reconnaissance. A chance to observe the court's true character from beneath its notice, to see which suitors behaved decently when they believed no one important was watching. A princess in disguise testing the realm. She had not expected to fall in love with a human tutor who got down on his knees to help gather spilled laundry, who looked at her like she was interesting rather than valuable, who said "I see you in a garden" and meant it as nothing but truth. She had not expected that the closer her true coronation loomed, rescheduled, quietly, for the season's turning, her advisers growing desperate as the empty throne became a diplomatic liability, the more unbearable it would feel to imagine revealing herself and losing, in the same breath, the only person who had ever chosen her before knowing what choosing her was worth. She confided none of this to Daniel. But she began, in small ways, to prepare herself for its ending. She started memorizing the particular way he laughed when a lesson went well. The crease at the corner of his eyes when he was trying not to smile at something the children had said. The low, steady sound of his voice reading aloud from human poetry he'd smuggled into her evenings, sitting on the garden wall with the twin moons rising, his shoulder warm against hers. She started, without quite admitting it to herself, saying goodbye to him a little every night, even as she returned to find him again every morning. What Daniel could not see, in those final weeks before the summons arrived, was the storm gathering behind the palace's inner doors. Chancellor Yold, the iron-furred woman who had served 3 monarchs and buried 2 of them, had spent 11 months managing a crisis the wider empire did not officially know existed. An empty throne, a missing heir, and a treasury of increasingly nervous allies who required, with mounting insistence, some assurance that the Vulpine crown remained stable enough to honor its treaties. She must be found and returned to the succession, argued Lord Kestrel, senior of the Regency Council, for what felt to Yold like the 400th time that season. Every season she delays, 3 more houses petition for a Regency vote. If she does not claim the throne by the turning of winter, we will have no throne left for her to claim. She will return when she is ready, Yold said, though privately she had begun to fear otherwise. Princess Varessa does nothing without reason. If she vanished, it was because remaining would have broken something in her that the Empire could not afford to lose. It was Yold herself who had finally traced the princess. Not through investigators, whom Varessa would have anticipated and evaded, but through simple, patient observation of the household registry, cross-referencing a maid named Varessa in the East Wing against a physical description too particular to belong to anyone but royalty. Yold had known for nearly 4 months. She had said nothing, watching instead, with something like reluctant hope, the slow transformation of a princess who had fled her own coronation into a woman who laughed freely in gardens with a human tutor who had no earthly idea what he'd stumbled into. "She's happier than I have seen her since her mother's death," Yold told the council, when at last the pressure from allied systems became impossible to defer further. "I would not have interrupted this for the Empire's convenience. But the Empire's patience has run out regardless, and I cannot protect her from that any longer. The choosing must proceed, with or without her willing return." It was Yold who drafted the summons that would find Daniel in his small guest chamber, and Yold who insisted, over Lord Kestrel's objections, that the invitation be extended to the human tutor as well as the rest of the household staff. A small mercy, granted quietly, because the old Chancellor had watched enough of Varessa's stolen evenings from a careful distance to understand exactly what the princess stood to lose, and exactly who deserved the chance to be present when she lost it. "You are fond of him," Kestrel observed, unable to hide his surprise. "I am fond of watching her be happy," Yold said. "It has been a long time since anyone in this palace could say the same." Chancellor Yold had not become the longest-serving advisor in Ashenvale's modern history by missing what happened beneath her own roof, and she had known, for the better part of 4 months, exactly what her runaway princess had been doing with her stolen evenings. She had first suspected it during a routine review of the household registry. An unremarkable maid named Varessa, East Wing, no recorded family, hired 11 months prior under circumstances the steward's office had, oddly, no clear record of. It was the kind of administrative gap that meant nothing to most eyes and everything to Yold's, trained across 5 decades to notice precisely the sort of absence a fleeing princess would leave behind her. She had confirmed it properly only once. A single evening, standing unseen at the edge of the garden, watching a maid with unmistakably royal bearing laugh at something the human tutor had said, tail curled loose and unguarded in a way Yold had not seen from the princess since before the Queen Mother's death. She had left without revealing herself, and had said nothing to the council, and had spent every day since carrying the enormous, quiet weight of a secret that was not truly hers to keep or reveal. It would have been easy, and perhaps in some strict sense more dutiful, to end the deception the moment she confirmed it. Return the princess to her proper apartments, resume the interrupted succession, spare the Empire 11 more months of diplomatic anxiety. Yold had turned the option over more than once, in the small hours when the weight of the empty throne pressed heaviest on her conscience. But she had also, across 5 decades of court service, buried a queen who had never once, in Yold's presence, laughed the way Varessa laughed in that garden, and Yold found, in the end, that she could not bring herself to be the one who took that laughter away before it had run its natural course. "You are gambling with the Empire's stability," she told herself, more than once, alone in her chambers with the reports that grew more urgent by the season. "You are gambling with a young woman's whole future on the strength of one evening's laughter in a garden." She gambled anyway. She told herself it was patience, the same patience that had guided every difficult decision of her long service. She suspected, privately, it was something closer to hope. An old woman's hope, worn thin by decades of watching duty crush exactly the kind of unguarded joy she glimpsed that evening, choosing, for once, to protect the joy instead of the duty, for as long as the Empire's patience would allow it. It was Yold, in the end, who decided the timing of the summons. Not rushed the moment Kestrel's pressure became unbearable, but held back 3 additional weeks past what strict duty required, because she had watched Daniel and Varessa's evenings grow steadily more tender in that time, and could not bring herself to end them 1 day sooner than necessary. When she finally drafted the invitation that would summon Daniel to the choosing ceremony, she included his name not because protocol demanded it of a tutor's rank, but because she had decided, quietly and entirely on her own authority, that whatever happened next, the man deserved the chance to be present for it rather than discover his heart had been staked in a ceremony he wasn't even invited to witness. It was, by any measure, an old chancellor meddling well outside the boundaries of her office. Yold did not regret it for a single moment, not then and not in all the years that followed, and she took a private, considerable satisfaction in being, however invisibly, one of the architects of the Empire's happiest scandal in living memory. The summons came on royal parchment, sealed with the crest of the throne, delivered by a page who bowed so low his nose nearly touched the floor. Daniel Mercer, human tutor to the royal household, is hereby invited to attend the coronation and choosing ceremony of Her Highness the Crown Princess, at which Her Highness shall present herself to the court and select a companion for the throne. Attendance is required of all household staff of tutor rank and above. Daniel read it twice, sitting alone in his small guest chamber, feeling a strange, cold weight settle in his chest that he couldn't immediately name. the Crown Princess. He'd heard whispers of her these past weeks. A princess long absent from public life, presumed to have fled some years back before her scheduled coronation, now finally returning to claim her throne and choose a husband from among the assembled suitors. The palace had been humming with preparations for a fortnight, banners raised, feast halls scrubbed, nobles from a dozen systems arriving in ships that gleamed like polished coins. He hadn't thought much of it. It was court business, distant from his small orbit of classrooms and gardens and stolen evenings with a maid he was slowly, helplessly, falling in love with. But something about the phrase choosing ceremony sat wrong in his stomach, and he couldn't say why, except that lately Varessa had seemed distracted in a way she never used to be. Quieter in the mornings, her ears held in a low, anxious set he'd started to recognize and worry over, her hand gripping his a fraction too tight when they sat together in the garden. That evening, he found her in their usual spot on the garden wall, and before he could stop himself, he asked, "Are you attending the choosing ceremony?" Something flickered across her face, too fast to read, gone before he could name it. In a manner of speaking, "Will you sit with me?" "I don't know anyone else who won't spend the whole ceremony discussing the treasury implications of every candidate." Varessa laughed, but it came out thin, edged with something Daniel couldn't place. "I don't think I'll be seated with the tutors, Daniel." "Why not?" She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the darkened gardens, her tail curled tight around her ankles in a way he'd never seen before, small, protective, nothing like her usual loose confidence. "Daniel," she said finally, and her voice had gone soft and strange, stripped of its usual wry ease. "Could you ever love a servant? Truly. Not as a diversion, not as something interesting to pass the time with in a strange palace. Could you love someone with nothing, no title, no fortune, no name that opens doors, and still choose her, even knowing every sensible reason not to?" Daniel turned to look at her fully, and something in her expression, raw, frightened, hopeful in a way she was clearly trying and failing to hide, made his chest ache. "Varessa," he said, taking her hand in both of his. "I already do." Her breath caught. Her ears, he saw, had gone fully flat with emotion, her eyes bright and wet in the moonlight, and for one perfect, suspended moment, Daniel believed they were about to have the conversation he'd been circling for weeks. The one where she finally told him whatever truths she'd been carrying, and he told her it changed nothing. Then the garden gates swung open, and 2 royal guards in full ceremonial dress strode in, dropping immediately to one knee before her. "Your Highness," the lead guard said, voice carrying clear across the quiet garden. "Forgive the intrusion. The court chancellor requests your presence." The choosing ceremony begins at dawn, and there are final preparations that require the crown princess's attention. The silence that followed was total. Daniel didn't move. Couldn't. The words rearranged themselves in his mind slowly, refusing at first to make the shape they so obviously made. "Your Highness. The Crown Princess." He looked at Varessa. At the amber fur, the emerald eyes, the unusually elegant tail he'd once thought simply beautiful and now understood had been beautiful because it had been bred that way, generations of royal lineage distilled into every graceful line of her, and watched her face crumple, just slightly, with something that looked like grief. "Daniel," she started. "You're the princess." His voice came out flatter than he intended, shock draining the warmth from it before he could stop it. "The one the whole court has been preparing for. The choosing ceremony, that's you. I was going to tell you." "When?" It came out sharper than he meant, 3 months of careful, growing love curdling suddenly into something that felt dangerously close to betrayal. "Before or after I made a fool of myself falling for a maid who was really royalty in disguise, testing which nobles would grovel and which ones would treat her decently? Was that what this was? A very long audition? No." Varessa rose, and even now, even caught, there was a dignity to her that Daniel realized he'd been seeing all along without naming it, the bearing of someone raised to carry weight without showing the strain. "It started that way. I won't lie to you about that. I disguised myself to observe the court honestly, to see past the performances everyone puts on for a princess. But Daniel, what happened between us stopped being an experiment within the first week. I fell in love with you as Varessa the maid because I forgot, entirely, that I was supposed to be testing anything. You made me forget I was a crown. You just saw me. I saw a lie, Daniel said, and hated how much it hurt to say it, hated the guards watching, hated the tears standing bright in her eyes. I saw exactly what you wanted me to see. You saw the only true thing I've been allowed to be in years. Her voice cracked. Please, Daniel. Your Highness, the guard interrupted, gently but firmly. The Chancellor is waiting. Varessa held Daniel's gaze one moment longer, something desperate and pleading in it, and then, because she was a princess before she was anything else, she straightened her shoulders, wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of one hand, and followed the guards out of the garden without another word. Daniel stood alone in the moonlight for a long time afterward, feeling like the ground had been completely removed from beneath him. The guards did not escort Daniel from the garden, exactly. No one had given such an order, and Daniel technically remained a member of the household staff with every right to walk its corridors. But he felt escorted regardless, in the way a person feels escorted by their own thoughts when those thoughts refuse to leave them alone. He walked the long way back to his chamber, through corridors he'd once gotten pleasantly lost in, past the servants' hall where he'd first learned Varessa's name, past the garden gate where guards now stood at rigid, ceremonial attention that made his stomach twist every time he passed one. The whole palace seemed to have shifted under his feet in the space of 10 minutes, every familiar hallway suddenly revealed to have been leading, all along, toward a truth he hadn't been permitted to see. He passed Orin near the east archway, and the old steward's ears flattened with something like sympathy when their eyes met. You knew, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. I suspected, Orin corrected gently. For some time. It is not my place to confirm the private business of the crown, Mercer, even to a man I've grown fond of. You let me fall for her without saying anything. I let you fall for her because it was the first time in 11 months I'd seen the princess laugh like she meant it, Orin said, and something in his weathered voice cracked, just slightly, with an old, careful affection. Forgive an old steward for choosing her happiness over your comfort. I would make the same choice again. Daniel didn't have an answer for that. He nodded, once, and kept walking, and did not stop until he reached his own small chamber, where he sat on the edge of the bed still dressed in his day clothes and stared at the wall for a long time without seeing it. He thought about calling Thessaly to make sense of it. She, at least, had tried to warn him, however obliquely, but pride kept him from it. He thought about seeking out the children's wing, finding Fennec or Sable and asking them, gently, what they'd known about their favorite maid all along, but that felt unfair to drag them into. In the end he did what he always did when the world grew too large and strange to hold. He found a piece of paper and began, uselessly, to draft a lesson plan for the following morning, because it was the one thing that still made sense, ordinary and small and entirely within his control. He got exactly 4 words into a unit on Vulpine human trade history before he set the pen down, put his head in his hands, and admitted to himself, in the privacy of an empty room, that he was still, despite everything, hopelessly in love with a woman he'd known for 3 months under a name that turned out to be only half of who she was. The question, he understood, was not whether he loved her. That answer had arrived long before the guards knelt in the garden, uncomplicated and entire. The question was whether love was enough to survive a lie this large, however gently it had been told, and whether he had it in him to forgive being kept in the dark by someone he trusted with every unguarded, foolish part of himself. He didn't know the answer yet. But he suspected, even as the thought formed, that he already did. That some part of him had decided the moment her hand found his across the kitchen table weeks ago, mending a hem by lamplight, long before either of them understood what exactly was being mended. He didn't sleep. He sat by his window watching the palace's upper towers, where he imagined, correctly, though he had no way to know it, Varessa was being dressed by attendants for the first time in 11 months in the full ceremonial regalia of the crown, gold thread markings restored to her fur, her hair grown back to royal length pinned with jewels that had waited in a vault for her return. He turned every conversation over in his mind, hunting for the lie in it, and found, disturbingly, that he couldn't. Every moment he examined the garden bench, the mended hem by lamplight, the hand that had found his across the kitchen table, held up under scrutiny. None of it had felt performed. All of it had felt, at the time and in memory both, entirely, achingly real. You made me forget I was a crown. You just saw me. He thought of Thessaly's warning. I don't think she's playing you. I think that's what worries me. He thought of Oren's careful evasions, the guard's half-suppressed bows, all the threads he'd noticed and refused to follow to their obvious end because some part of him had wanted, desperately, for Varessa to be exactly what she presented herself as, simple, unguarded, choosing him for no reason but the plain fact of who he was. Maybe, he thought as dawn began to gray the sky outside his window, that was exactly what she had been. Maybe the lie hadn't been in what she felt. Maybe the lie had only ever been in what she was allowed to call herself. He thought of his own life, a teacher who'd moved from colony to colony, never quite belonging anywhere long enough to be known fully, always the visiting outsider whose interior life nobody bothered to ask about because he was useful in his function and invisible outside of it. He thought of how Varessa had been the first person in this whole strange, glittering palace who had asked him real questions and waited, patiently, for real answers. Hadn't he done the same for her? Hadn't he been the first person to say I see you and mean the whole of her, not the function she performed? By the time the ceremonial bells began ringing across Ashenvale, calling the court to the choosing, Daniel had made his decision. He dressed in the formal robes he still didn't quite know how to wear, and went to find out if it was too late to unmake his own foolish anger. Word of the human tutor's strange attachment to a palace maid had, by the morning of the choosing, already traveled further than Daniel could have guessed, carried through servant gossip into noble gossip into the ears of at least one visiting dignitary shrewd enough to see opportunity in another man's heartbreak. Ambassador Corvin, third son of a wealthy trading house from the outer systems and among the more determined of Varessa's suitors, found Daniel in the palace's antechamber that morning, ostensibly to offer condolences, though his tone carried considerably more calculation than sympathy. A hard thing, Corvin said, settling uninvited into the seat beside him, tail flicking with barely concealed satisfaction. To learn the woman you loved was never who she claimed to be. I understand the impulse toward anger. I'd feel it myself, in your position. I don't recall asking for your understanding. No, but you might want my offer regardless. Corvin's smile widened, all teeth, the same practiced warmth Daniel had come to recognize among the nobles who wanted something. The Empire will need to smooth this transition delicately, whatever the princess decides today. A quiet departure on your part. A generous transport home, a modest settlement to ease the adjustment, no scandal attached to either of you, would serve everyone's interest considerably better than a human tutor causing a scene at a coronation he was never meant to attend. I could arrange it within the hour. Daniel studied him for a long moment, understanding with sudden, cold clarity exactly what was being offered and exactly why. Corvin did not want to spare Daniel's feelings. Corvin wanted one fewer complication standing between himself and a crown. You're worried, Daniel said slowly, that she actually meant it. Whatever she said to me in that garden? You're not here out of kindness, Ambassador. You're here because you're afraid I might actually matter to her, and that terrifies you a great deal more than any scandal would. Corvin's smile thinned, the mask slipping just slightly. I am here to offer a practical solution to an awkward situation. I appreciate the practicality. I'm declining it regardless. Daniel rose, straightening his unfamiliar ceremonial robes with as much dignity as he could summon. Whatever happens today, Ambassador, it won't be decided by a settlement in a hallway. It'll be decided by Varessa, in front of the whole court, because that's apparently the kind of woman she is, the sort who says the hard true thing in public rather than letting men like you arrange it quietly beforehand. He left Corvin sitting alone in the antechamber, jaw tight with the particular fury of a man who had expected an easier morning, and walked toward the throne hall with his pulse hammering and his resolve, if anything, considerably firmer than it had been an hour before. The throne hall of Ashenvale Palace had been built for exactly this moment, Daniel realized as he was ushered. With visible confusion from the ceremonial staff, who clearly hadn't expected the human tutor to arrive at all, let alone arrive pushing toward the front of the assembled crowd, into a space so vast and gilded it seemed to swallow sound itself. Suitors from a dozen systems stood arrayed along the hall's edges in their finest court dress. Vulpine lords with jeweled tails, off-world dignitaries in ceremonial armor, a scattering of ambitious younger sons whose families had clearly spent fortunes on this single, glittering chance. Above them all, on a dais wrapped in silver vine, sat the throne of Ashenvale, empty still, waiting. The Chancellor, an elderly Vulpine woman with iron-gray fur and a voice that filled the hall without seeming to raise itself, stood before the assembly and began the ceremony's ancient recitation, something about lineage and duty and the Empire's long patience, waiting for its missing heir to return. Daniel barely heard it. His eyes were fixed on the side chamber's curtained archway, where he knew, with a certainty he couldn't explain, Varessa was waiting to be announced. When the curtain finally parted, the entire hall seemed to draw one collective breath. She was radiant in a way that made Daniel's chest physically ache, not because she was more beautiful than the maid he'd fallen for, but because he could see now, watching her walk the long aisle toward the throne in ceremonial gold and white, gems threaded through amber fur that caught the light like captured sunlight, that this was the same person entirely. The same steady walk. The same tilt of her ears, fighting nerves with visible effort. The same emerald eyes that found his, for one brief, electric second, across the crowded hall, before she made herself look away. Every suitor along the walls straightened, performed their best expressions of devoted admiration, calculated their approach. Varessa, Princess Varessa Ashenkel, crown heir of the Vulpine Empire, ascended the dais, turned to face the assembled court, and did not sit. "Before the choosing begins," she said, and her voice, amplified by the hall's ancient acoustics, carried to every corner, "I would like to say something the ceremony does not traditionally require." The Chancellor's ears flattened in alarm. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "For 11 months, I lived in this palace as a servant," Varessa continued, and Daniel watched the hall erupt into a controlled, horrified hush. "I did this because I was tired. Tired of being valued for a crown I hadn't chosen to wear, tired of suitors who recited poetry about my beauty while calculating my treasury's worth, tired of never once, in my whole life, being certain that anyone wanted me rather than what I represent. I disguised myself to find out which of you might treat a woman with nothing the way you claim you would treat a princess with everything." Her eyes swept the assembled suitors, and several, Daniel noted with grim satisfaction, visibly flinched. "Most of you never spoke to the maids who served your feasts. Several of you spoke to them poorly. One of you," her gaze found a particular lord near the front, who went pale, "dismissed a servant from your chambers so violently she required medical attention for the bruise on her wrist. I have not forgotten. Nor will the throne." The hall had gone utterly silent. "There was one person in this palace," Varessa said, and her voice softened, turned toward the crowd but somehow, Daniel felt, aimed entirely at him, "who never once asked what I could give him. Who got down on the floor to help a stranger pick up spilled laundry. Who said, in a garden one evening, that he saw me, not the crown, not the beauty the whole galaxy apparently cannot stop commenting on, but me, and meant it with his whole plain, honest heart. He is a human tutor with no fortune, no title, and no interest whatsoever in the treasury reports of a throne he didn't even know I sat upon." She looked directly at Daniel now, and the entire hall turned with her, 1,000 eyes finding him where he stood, stunned, at the edge of the crowd. "I do not want a prince," Varessa said, her voice ringing clear and sure through the ancient hall. "I have never wanted a prince. I want the man who chose me before he knew I was worth choosing for any reason but myself." Daniel Mercer, if you can forgive a princess for lying about being a maid, I choose you. I have chosen you since the day you got down on your knees over a basket of dropped linens and treated me like I mattered." For one endless moment, Daniel stood frozen, 1,000 vulpine eyes fixed on him, the weight of the entire ceremony balanced on whatever he said next. Then he thought of the garden wall, and the mended hem by lamplight, and her hand finding his across a kitchen table, and the particular, unguarded way she'd laughed the very first time they met. A laugh that had been real, he understood now, all the way down, whatever else had been hidden underneath it. He crossed the hall. The suitors parted for him, some with visible fury, some with grudging, startled respect. And Daniel climbed the dais steps two at a time, entirely disregarding whatever protocol existed for approaching a crown princess mid-ceremony, and stopped before her, close enough to see her ears trembling with hope she was visibly trying not to show too plainly. "I was angry," Daniel said, quiet enough that only she could hear it, though the hall's acoustics likely carried it to every corner regardless. "I'm still a little angry. You let me fall for you without the whole truth, and that's going to take some time to fully forgive." "I know," Varessa whispered. "But I spent the whole night trying to find the lie in every moment we shared, and I couldn't find one. Not one. You were never pretending to be someone who cared about my lessons, or laughed at my jokes, or held my hand like it meant something. That was real. The only thing that wasn't real was the dress you wore while you did it. Daniel. I don't care about the crown," he said, and meant it more fully than he'd meant almost anything in his life. "I care about the woman who mended a hem by lamplight and asked if I could love a servant." The answer was yes then, Varessa, and it's still yes now, whether the servant turns out to be a princess or the princess turns out to be a servant or whatever ridiculous, impossible combination of both you actually are. I choose you. I chose you a long time before I understood there was anything grand to be gained by it. Varessa made a small, broken sound, half laugh, half sob, and closed the last distance between them, her arms wrapping around his neck, her face pressed into his shoulder as her whole body shook with the release of 11 months of careful, exhausting performance finally allowed to end. The hall erupted, some cheers, genuine and startled. Some furious murmuring from suitors whose ambitions had just publicly collapsed, the Chancellor's stunned silence eventually breaking into what might, on her weathered face, have been the beginning of a smile. "This is either the most romantic thing that has ever happened in this hall," Varessa said into his shoulder, muffled and laughing and crying all at once. "Or the least. I contain multitudes," Daniel said, and felt her laugh properly this time, warm and real against him, exactly the way it had felt the very first day, in a servant's corridor, over a basket of spilled linens either of them had needed to stop for. Not everyone accepted the choosing's outcome gracefully. Within the hour, Lord Kestrel, senior of the Regency Council, and father to one of the spurned suitors, had convened an emergency session of the Chancellery, demanding the ceremony be declared void on the grounds that a crown princess could not legally bind herself to a commoner of an allied but non-vulpine species without a formal ratification vote from the full council. "This is unprecedented," Kestrel said, pacing the Chancellery floor while Yod watched with the patient, immovable calm of someone who had outlasted several such tantrums in her long career. 800 years of succession law, and she means to overturn it in a single afternoon, over a laundry basket? 800 years of succession law, Yod said, has never once addressed the situation of a princess disguising herself as household staff for the better part of a year, so I confess I am unsure which precedent you believe we're violating, precisely. The spirit of the law, if not its letter. The spirit of the law, Yod said, exists to ensure the throne is occupied by someone with the judgment and character to hold it well. I have watched Princess Varessa's judgment and character for 11 months from closer than anyone in this room, Lord Kestrel, in circumstances considerably more revealing than a ballroom. I have never been more confident in a monarch's fitness to rule. The council argued long into the night. Treaties to be reworded, allied houses to be placated, the delicate question of what rights and titles, if any, a human consort ought to hold within Vulpine law. Daniel, summoned partway through to answer questions about his intentions that felt, to him, both invasive and entirely fair given the stakes, sat through 2 hours of interrogation from council members who ranged from openly hostile to cautiously curious. "You understand," said one counselor, an elderly woman with silver-streaked fur and a voice like dry parchment, "that marrying the crown princess means marrying an empire, not merely a woman. Are you prepared for that weight?" "I wasn't prepared for any of this," Daniel admitted, which drew a startled ripple of not quite laughter from several counselors. "I came here to teach children arithmetic. I fell in love with a maid who mended hems and asked good questions." "If you're asking whether I understand everything that comes with an empire, no. I don't. But I understand her, or at least I'm trying to, and I intend to keep trying for as long as she'll let me. If that's not sufficient qualification for the council, I understand, but I won't pretend to a confidence about statecraft I don't actually have." It was, unexpectedly, the honesty that won them over. Or won over enough of them, at least, alongside Yold's quiet, relentless advocacy and Varessa's own icy refusal to entertain any version of events that ended with her being married off to Kestrel's son instead. "I did not flee my own coronation for 11 months. Varessa told the assembled council, standing before them with a composure that made even Kestrel fall silent. "To be lectured now about the spirit of the law by men who spent that entire time competing to inherit my treasury. I have made my choice. The council may ratify it, or it may explain to the Empire's allied systems why it chose to overturn its own crown princess's judgment on the flimsy technicality of her husband's species. I do not believe that is a conversation any of you actually wished to have." The vote, when it finally came near dawn, passed with a margin that surprised even Yold, 12 in favor, 3 opposed, Kestrel among the dissenters but outnumbered and, for the moment, defeated. Daniel and Varessa found each other afterward in the same garden where it had all unraveled, both of them hollowed out with exhaustion, and sat together on the wall without speaking for a long while, simply grateful to have survived a night neither of them had expected to need surviving. "I'm sorry," Varessa said eventually, "that you had to sit through that. Being interrogated about your worthiness by people who've never once been asked to justify their own." "I'd do it again," Daniel said. "Every hour of it. I just didn't expect falling for a maid to come with a council vote attached." "Welcome to my whole life," Varessa said, and managed, despite everything, something that was almost a laugh. The weeks that followed were, by any measure, complicated. There were furious ambassadors to placate, treaties to renegotiate now that the crown's marriage would bind Vulpine interests to a human colony's rather than a rival system's noble house, chancellery meetings that ran long into the night, while advisors debated precedent for a human consort with no equivalent in 800 years of royal history. There was Thessaly, who cornered Daniel again in the receiving hall, tail held high with something that looked suspiciously like pride. "I told you I found you tolerable," she said. "I did not expect this level of tolerable. The Crown Princess. Truly, human tutor, you continue to surprise." "I had no idea," Daniel said honestly. "For what it's worth. I know. That was rather the entire point of her experiment, wasn't it?" Thessaly's ears tilted, almost fond. "For what it's worth, I'm glad it was you. The others would have made her miserable within a year." There was Orin, who bowed to Daniel properly for the first time, a full, formal bow, none of the careful evasions of before, and said only, "The captain's stopwatch approves, Mercer." Belatedly. "But it approves." And there was Varessa herself, freed at last from the exhausting weight of pretending to be only a maid, or only a princess, allowed for the first time in her adult life to simply be both at once. The crown heir who still, some mornings, snuck down to the palace kitchens to mend a hem herself because her hands missed the simple, honest work of it, and the woman who still laughed, loud and unguarded, at Daniel's terrible human jokes in the garden where they'd first begun to fall for each other, moonlight and stolen evenings and a truth that had, in the end, needed no disguise at all to be worth choosing. "Do you regret it?" Varessa asked him once, months later, sitting on their old garden wall as the twin moons rose pale over the towers, her tail curled contentedly around his ankle in the easy, unguarded way it had that very first evening. Choosing a princess who lied to you for 11 months? Daniel considered this with the seriousness the question deserved, watching her ears tilt forward, waiting, the way they always had. I chose a maid who was funny and curious and asked real questions, he said finally. It turns out she was also a princess. I don't think that's a lie, Varessa. I think that's just the whole truth, arriving in installments. Varessa's eyes went bright and wet in the moonlight, the way they had the night she'd asked if he could ever love a servant, and she leaned into him, warm and solid and entirely, finally, unhidden. I love you, she said. As a maid, as a princess, as whatever ridiculous combination of both I remain. I have never said it more truly than I say it now. I love you too, Daniel said. Amber fur, emerald eyes, elegant tail, terrible taste in disguises, and all. She laughed, that same unguarded laugh from the very first day. And above them, the twin moons climbed higher over Ashenvale, and somewhere below in the palace's ancient stones, guards who had once bowed to her in secret now did so openly, and a whole empire settled, gladly, into the strange and honest shape of a crown chosen not for its worth, but for the simple, radical fact of being seen. The months between the choosing and the formal coronation were, for Daniel, an education more demanding than any he'd ever given. There were court customs to learn that no lesson plan had prepared him for. The precise angle of bow owed to a visiting ambassador versus a minor lord, the 17 distinct ways a vulpine tail could communicate displeasure at a state dinner, the alarming discovery that his own species' habit of maintaining steady eye contact registered, in certain vulpine social contexts, as a subtle challenge to rank. He failed at most of it, repeatedly, with the good-natured patience of a man who had spent his career failing in front of children and had long ago made peace with looking foolish in service of eventually looking less foolish. Fennec, delighted to finally have official standing as Daniel's cultural advisor, took his new responsibilities with grave seriousness. You bowed to the ambassador from the outer colonies like he was a duke, the boy informed him after one particularly disastrous reception. He's only a trade envoy. You've probably confused the entire diplomatic corps. I'll add it to the list, Daniel said, and did, on a piece of parchment that had grown embarrassingly long. Varessa, for her part, spent those months relearning her own life from the opposite direction. Reclaiming rooms she'd fled from, reacquainting herself with advisors and ceremonies and the particular, exhausting weight of being watched again after 11 months of blessed anonymity. I forgot how loud it is, she confided to Daniel one evening, both of them exhausted on the garden wall after a day of ceremonial fittings and treasury briefings. Being a princess. Not the sound exactly. The attention. Everyone in every room recalibrating themselves around what I might want, what I might mean, what my smallest gesture might be worth. I'd forgotten how much smaller a person feels when there's that much noise directed at them. Do you regret coming back? No. She said it without hesitation, threading her fingers through his. I regret how long it took me to understand that the answer to that noise wasn't disappearing forever. It was finding one person who could stand in the middle of it with me and still see me clearly. I found that faster as a maid than I ever expected to as a princess. I'm grateful for it every single day, even the loud ones. There were harder moments too. Nights when the weight of the throne pressed close enough that Varessa grew quiet and distant in ways Daniel was still learning to read, mornings when some noble's thinly veiled insult about the human experiment left her jaw tight through an entire breakfast. Daniel learned slowly the particular kind of patience a partnership like theirs required. Not fixing every hard thing, because most of it wasn't his to fix, but simply staying present through it, the way she had once stayed present through his own bewildered first weeks navigating a palace that hadn't wanted him there either. You're doing that thing again, Varessa told him once, catching him watching her with careful concern during a particularly grim council briefing. What thing? Making sure I'm all right without asking if I'm all right, Because you know I'll say yes whether it's true or not. Her ears softened. It's a very specific skill, Daniel. I don't think anyone's had it for me before. Occupational hazard of teaching children who lie about being fine when they've skinned a knee, Daniel said. You get good at reading the truth underneath the answer. Is that what I am? A very tall child who's skinned her knee on an empire? Sometimes, Daniel said, and kissed her before she could argue. Yes. And I intend to keep checking on you regardless of what you tell me, for as long as you'll have me. Good, Varessa murmured against his mouth. I was rather hoping that was the arrangement. The second coronation, the real one, held 3 months after the choosing ceremony, once the chancellery had finished untangling 800 years of precedent regarding human consorts. Was a quieter affair than anyone had expected, at Varessa's own insistence. I've had enough ceremony to last a lifetime, she told Yol, while attendants fussed over the hem of a gown considerably simpler than the one she'd worn to reclaim her throne. Small. Honest. The people who actually matter, rather than every ambassador with a treaty to renegotiate. It was, by Ashenvale standards, a modest gathering. The household staff given places of honor for the first time in the Empire's memory, Fennec and Sable seated proudly in the second row with the other court children, Orin standing at attention near the dais with an expression of such carefully restrained pride that Thessaly teased him about it for a week afterward. Daniel stood beside the throne rather than among the suitors this time, dressed in robes he'd finally learned to wear without help, and when Yod placed the narrow circlet of Ashenvale on Varessa's brow, smaller and plainer than the ceremonial crown from months before, an old piece reserved for private coronations, worn by monarchs who wanted the moment to belong to themselves rather than to spectacle. Varessa reached for Daniel's hand without looking away from the gathered household, and held it through the whole of the ancient recitation. Do you, Varessa Ashenkel, accept the weight of this crown? Yold intoned. And swear to carry it not as your definition, but as your duty? I do, Varessa said. And I swear, additionally, to remember always that I carried a laundry basket for 11 months and was happier doing it than I had been in years wearing silk. The crown does not get to make me forget that again. A ripple of surprised, delighted laughter moved through the hall, an unprecedented addition to 8 centuries of solemn oath-taking, and precisely, Yol thought privately, the kind of monarch Ashenvale had been quietly starving for. If the coronation had been small and quiet by Varessa's insistence, the wedding, held the following spring, once the last of the treaty renegotiations had finally settled, was permitted to be exactly as large and unruly as an empire celebrating its first human consort apparently required, whether the bride wanted it that size or not. I said small, Varessa muttered to Daniel, watching from a side chamber as attendants scurried past with what appeared to be an entire greenhouse's worth of flowering vine destined for the great hall. I distinctly remember saying small. You said the coronation should be small. You never specified the wedding. Daniel, resplendent and deeply uncomfortable in ceremonial robes threaded with actual gold, adjusted his collar for the 40th time. I believe Yold took advantage of the loophole. Yold is a menace, and I love her dearly. The ceremony itself, when it finally arrived, blended customs from both their worlds in a manner that several older court traditionalists found faintly alarming and most of the younger household found delightful. There was the Vulpine bonding rite, an old ritual involving braided cords of fur-dyed thread, tied between the couple's joined hands to symbolize lives now woven together, performed by Yold herself with a solemnity that briefly reduced half the hall to tears. And there was, at Daniel's quiet request, a human tradition too. Vows spoken aloud in his own language first, then translated, the assembled Vulpine court listening with visible fascination to the unfamiliar cadence of human wedding language before the more familiar Ashenvale rites resumed. Thessaly, seated in the second row in a gown that had clearly cost more than several small moons, cried through the entire thing and denied it afterward with such ferocity that Daniel privately resolved never to mention it again, out of self-preservation. Fennec and Sable, now old enough to be trusted with minor ceremonial duties, carried the bonding cords up the aisle with an expression of such intense, focused seriousness that Varessa had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing at the sight of Fennec's ears pinned flat with concentration, terrified of dropping his charge. Orin stood near the dais throughout, and when the final vows were spoken and the hall erupted into cheering, Daniel caught the old steward's eye across the crowd and saw, unmistakably, a single tear tracking down through the fur of his weathered cheek before he turned it briskly into a cough and pretended otherwise. The reception ran long into the night. Feasting and dancing and toasts from council members who, 6 months earlier, had argued furiously against this exact outcome and now, with the particular flexibility of politicians everywhere, toasted it as though they'd championed it from the start. Lord Kestrel, notably, did not attend, though his absence was quietly, universally understood to be for the best. It was near midnight, during a rare lull in the festivities, that Daniel finally pulled Varessa away from the crowd and out onto the small balcony overlooking the gardens, where the noise of the reception faded to a distant murmur beneath the clear night sky. "Regrets?" he asked, echoing her own long-ago question back to her, both of them still catching their breath from the last dance. "Only that it took us so long to get here." Varessa leaned into him, the weight of the ceremonial crown finally set aside for the evening, nothing between them now but two people who had chosen each other twice, once in ignorance, and once in full, complicated knowledge of everything the choice would cost and require. "Do you remember what you said that first day? In the corridor?" "I said let me help, and then made an idiot of myself staring at you for an embarrassingly long time." "You said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like helping a stranger pick up laundry was simply what a person did, no calculation required." Her hand found his, fingers lacing together with the easy familiarity of 1,000 such moments now behind them, and Daniel hoped, several thousand more ahead. "I'd never met anyone who did anything without calculation before you. I didn't know it was possible until I watched you do it without even noticing you'd done it." "For the record," Daniel said, "I'm still doing it. No calculation. Just you, exactly as you are, crown or no crown, whatever comes next." Below them, the garden stretched dark and quiet toward the palace walls, lanterns from the wedding feast still glowing faintly gold through the windows behind them, and somewhere above, the twin moons climbed their familiar, patient path across a sky that had witnessed, over 800 years, a great many coronations and considerably fewer marriages built on nothing grander than a dropped basket of laundry and a stranger who knelt down to help. They kept the garden wall. It became, in the years that followed, through the slow work of building trust between human colonies and the Vulpine throne, through Daniel's continued teaching, now expanded to a proper academy he founded with the crown's backing for children of every station rather than only the court's favored few, through the eventual arrival of 2 children of their own, a boy with his father's steady patience and his mother's sharp curiosity, and a girl whose amber fur came in, to everyone's quiet delight, exactly the shade of her mother's. A fixed point in an otherwise transformed life. Varessa still snuck down to the kitchen sometimes, when the weight of ruling grew heavy, and mended things with her own hands because the simple, honest work of it steadied something in her that state dinners never could. Daniel still read aloud from human poetry on the garden wall in the evenings, the twin moons rising the way they always had, and Varessa still laughed at all his terrible jokes, unguarded, exactly the way she had the very first day, over a basket of spilled linens neither of them had needed to stop for. "Tell me the story again," their daughter demanded once, years later, curled between them on the garden wall, too young yet to understand thrones or treaties but old enough to love a good story. "How you found each other. Your mother dropped a basket of laundry," Daniel said, "and I got down on the floor to help her, because that seemed like the obviously correct thing to do." "That's not romantic," their son objected, ever the serious one, arms crossed the way Phoenix had been at that age. "It's the most romantic thing that ever happened to me," Varessa said, resting her head against Daniel's shoulder, the crown of a shenveil gleaming faint and silver in the moonlight, no heavier now than it had ever needed to be. "Because your father chose me before he had any reason to. Before there was a crown in it for him, or a kingdom, or anything at all except a stranger on the floor who seemed worth helping. That's the whole secret of it, if you want to know. Everything else. The palace, the throne, the guards who bow, that's just the world catching up to a choice that was already true. The lanterns rose that night the way they always did during the autumn festival, drifting past the towers of Ashenvale in their slow, glowing constellation, and somewhere beneath them, in a garden that had seen a maid become a princess and a stranger become a husband, the twin moons climbed steady and unhurried over a kingdom that had, at last, found its heart exactly where it belonged.